The following is a CUNY TV special presentation.
I'm Bob Woodward from the Washington Post. Let me introduce the panel. We've got a great group. First, Jane Mayer, who I've known forever, it seems. Worked at the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker now for almost 20 years. It's astonishing. Many journalism honors, especially for your 2008 book, The Dark Side. How the war on terror turned into the war on American ideals. So that's one of those titles where you know where you're coming from. We have Bob Dietz in the middle here, the distinguished professor of public policy at George Mason. He's been the consigliere to the intelligence community. Did you work for Allen Dulles or not? No. The first CIA director. Bob was general counsel to the NSA for 8 years. Is that correct? Amazing. He then was the counselor to the CIA director, General Hayden, for 3 years. He's worked in Defense Department, State Department, and was unbelievably a law clerk to Justice William O. Douglas, one of the great civil libertarians. So we'll get to the question of what Douglas would think of your career path. Mark Mazzetti of the New York Times worked for The Economist, U.S. News, L.A. Times, shared in a Pulitzer Prize for great reporting on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and I think I want to say this from the point of view of the Washington Post, covers particularly the Senate Intelligence Committee better than anyone. And next to him at the end is Peter Moss, senior writer for New Look Media. It's written for just about First Look, I'm sorry. Done a number of books, including the book Love Thy Neighbor on Bosnia, the war in Bosnia. Want to make this a conversation, not presentations, and do not hesitate to interrupt. I'll do the same if that's okay. And our topic is the perils of covering national security, and I think we'll start with Jane and go around. What are the perils of covering national security now?
Well, I think it's become harder in that I think that our sources are under more pressure than they used to be. And so I've had a source in particular during the Bush years who was under investigation by the Justice Department for violating national security and for having spoken to me. My phone number appeared on his cell phone, apparently, and it ruined his life for quite a while. It was very expensive for him to get legal counsel.
Do we know who this is?
I don't think I should identify him, but he was falsely accused and eventually cleared. But the point was that during that period, you know, the cliche about what happens to the press in such situations is that it has a chilling effect. It wasn't just chilling, it was frozen. He couldn't speak. I couldn't speak to him. I was toxic to others who wouldn't want to get drawn into this snare.
And this was the Bush administration,
this was during the Bush. This was during the Bush years, and I don't think it's probably loosened up a lot since. But it has when there are more legal risks for sources, there's not a clear dividing line between the sources and the journalism that comes from them. It becomes an issue for the reporters as well. We get people in trouble by interviewing them when we don't mean to, and
when we don't need to.
When we don't mean to.
Okay.
Right? No, not we get them in trouble. We put them at legal risk. We can't guarantee that we're not going to put them at legal risk. It makes it very hard to get stories and tell the truth about what the government's doing, and holding it accountable is basically what we're trying to do. So,
And so is it tougher now?
yeah, I think it is tougher now. I think for sure.
Bob Dietz.
Yeah, inevitably in conferences like this, there's a lot of talk about the risks that reporters undertake, editors undertake in reporting the news. And of course, the First Amendment makes it clear that news is important to the American people. The trouble I have is that while that goal, that role is very important, the government also has an important goal, and that is to keep the American people safe. You know, what we're talking about here are national security leaks. We're not talking about leaks from the FDA or the Department of Agriculture. We're talking about leaks that may, in some circumstances, imperil the safety of the United States. Between those two issues, I think that the safety of the American people wins. Now, I understand the importance of the press, the important role the press plays, but by hypothesis, stuff that's highly classified, provided to people who swear that they will not violate the confidentiality that's been provided them, and then go ahead and leak it, and then the press publishes it, to me, they imperil the safety.
Bob, do you think there have been examples of things that have been published that really have endangered the American people?
Yes, I do.
Example.
Well, if I could just tell the principle first, then I'll give you an
Okay.
example. The principle is that in the intelligence area, the leak ends up being the harm. You know, in other words, if something's leaked about some new military capability, yeah, that's serious, but the bad guys still have to figure out how to counter that new weapon system or that new defense, whatever. In the intelligence area, when you leak information about how information was acquired, the bad guys immediately know, stop using that means of communication, or that means of communication. And that's I think, very risky.
So do you have an example, though?
Yeah, I think that the leak involving that special NSA program during the Bush years was very damaging.
In what way? You were there at the NSA
Yes,
at the time.
yes. I was told, and I think I was told responsibly, that you would get a stream of data, and then all of a sudden it would stop, and you'd see a correlation. It wasn't like anybody said, "Oh wow, NSA's onto us, we must stop using this." But you'd get intercepts, and then they would stop, and you'd see the correlation between the leak and the stopping of the communication.
Okay. Mark, what do you think is the main peril of covering national security?
I agree with a lot of what Jane said about the difficulty these days. I don't think it's ever been harder to do this kind of reporting. It's not only the crackdown that has taken place on leakers and the number of investigations that create this climate that Jane talked about. You also, in the wake of the revelations over the last year about surveillance, has created this, perception among people that the surveillance is everywhere, right, and that everything is being watched. And so, a similar experience to Jane, you have people who you have developed relationships with over the years who won't talk anymore because they're concerned. People who otherwise may have been, on the fence, who have never dealt with reporters, who might be inclined to do it, I think maybe second guess it, and they start to think, what's in it for me to do this? You have phone calls with people, used to be sort of ironically talking on the phone, and they say, so if anyone's listening to this call, I'm not revealing anything. Now, actually, people, without any irony, will say on the phone, whoever is listening to this call, I am not revealing classified, just like it's accepted that somebody's listening to this phone call, which is...
Do you think they are?
I mean, possibly. It's like, I think over the last year, whether it's people listening to my calls or my sources, they're trying to get the source, I think increasingly we certainly have to be under suspicion that more and more things are being monitored.
But you're still able to function and work.
You have to work. You have to function differently. You have to be more careful, certainly, about electronic communication, about phone calls. It's less efficient, I suppose, and especially at a daily paper, that can be hard.
So how do you communicate? Do you move the flower pot?
You meet parking garages.
Yeah.
You try to have more first-person meetings. I mean, there's also,
But to set those up,
it's hard. You have to somehow set them up in some means, by some means, and people are going to encrypted communications now. I think that, if you do that, both sides have to be doing it, right? So I think the concern is about when you're a reporter and you want to get someone to be comfortable and to talk to you, and you've never met this person, and the first thing you say is, "Hi, I want to talk to you," and you've got to use this phone because otherwise you're going to go to jail. Who's going to want to talk? Again,
so do you use encrypted communication?
I don't know how much I should say, but
yes, I
decide.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's more recent. I didn't used to.
Yeah, and that's got to be, you are talking to somebody for the first time or for the 20th time and say, let's go encrypted. Aren't they smart enough to realize that automatically that is an admission that there is some sort of transaction going on? That
people surveilling the situation?
Well, no, but just, if they find out X, Y, and Z have established encrypted communications with the intelligence reporter for the New York Times, that's semi-incriminating, right, Mr. Dietz?
Yes.
Yeah. So,
I think we can all agree on that.
Yes, right.
Maybe we're just talking about sports.
Yeah, okay. Good luck. Peter, what's the main peril here?
Well, I would just first off, just to kind of respectfully disagree with what Bob said here about leaks being the harm. I think in many cases the lack of leaks is the harm. If there had been more leaks, for example, in 2002, 2003 about the intelligence upon which the decision to invade Iraq was made, our national security would have been better rather than harmed. That's just a kind of basic point. We can talk more about that perhaps. But it is more difficult for everybody up here, for people in the audience, for people who are watching. One example I'll give is a number of months ago, somebody, if you're asking kind of like how this works and how it doesn't work, a number of months ago, somebody contacted me through a friend and had something that this person wanted to kind of talk about and provide to me that related to Iraq, and it wasn't monumental, but it was interesting. And I said to this person, okay, and we were talking not through phones that could be traced to me at least. Don't send it to me via email. Print it out, and here's the address, send it to me over the mail. Because at this moment in time, I think mail is more secure than email for certain things. And this was a workaround, which did not work because I never received this material. Either it was intercepted or wasn't sent. I believe it wasn't sent. And so having to set up that kind of security operation obviously affected the fact that this person did not provide the material. And that is a cost, a tax in a way, on this new era that we're in. Yes, sources will not come forward. But I would say that, on the other hand, and this is why I don't like necessarily the framing of this in such a kind of dirge-like way, we as journalists are presented now with this incredible, challenging, exciting story. Kind of the story of our lives. I feel like I've had several of these stories of our lives. And it's hard, but it's
what is that story? Just define it.
In my view, the story is challenges to the Fourth and First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which involves a crackdown on journalists ourselves and our sources. And I think that we have this incredible role to play to expose what is going on, to try to prevent it from continuing to go on. And this is, I covered in most of my life overseas conflicts, kind of made my name, I guess, in a way, in Bosnia first. And boy, there was a story that people here didn't really care very much, but that also it was difficult to cover because it was hard to make people here understand why it would affect this country, America, and their lives. And I couldn't make a very persuasive argument about that. But boy, when you're talking about challenges to the First and Fourth Amendments of the Constitution, you are talking about how life is lived, how our democracy exists, what the future for our children is as members of a free society. That's a much easier argument to make and a much more important one than the slaughter of some people in the Balkans. And I find myself as challenged and as kind of passionate about this story as I did about genocide in the Balkans.
Okay. Jane, go ahead.
All I was going to say to Bob was that I think what's hard one of the things that's difficult from the standpoint of the press is the the way that the national security community sometimes, and you in this case, define what's protecting the American public. It's not as if the press is trying to harm the American public. We just define it as a stronger country when there's a free flow of ideas, when there's consent of the governed because they understand what the programs are that you are implementing in their name. And we feel that even bad news sometimes strengthens the country because the rest of the world gets to see that our transparency and our accountability system. And so it's a larger framing of what national security is, but because of, as the panel before defined it, because of the way the executive branch has kind of a monopoly on defining what national security is, you get to put your own parameters around it and define us as outside of it sometimes. But we're not trying to harm the country by writing these stories. In fact, I think most reporters feel that they are really helping by getting this information out to the voters.
I accept most of what you said. I mean, I too agree that reporters are not out to undermine the country. But I also am very clear in my mind that reporters often do not understand why something can be harmful or why certain kinds of things would be guarded. Now, one of the arguments that's always dragged out in these kinds of meetings is the overclassification of materials, and I accept that. I'm sure they are. And this is not, I think, caused generally by evil intentions. I think it's that when people are writing reports, you know, there are 3 different classification levels. Most people just put the default, top secret. Now, there ought to be a way of addressing that, for sure.
Okay, but this, reporters are not helpless in this. And Bob Dietz, you're saying, oh, look, reporters don't understand the implications of publishing some of this stuff. But, I mean, as Mark, I'm sure, and Peter and Jane can testify to, when you find out something, you go to the government and you engage in, let's be honest, a negotiation of sorts and a listening, like one of Hillary Clinton's listening tours. You go listen and you say, what is the argument that this is going to cause harm? And if you look at the Snowden case in my own newspaper, the Washington Post, we have been extremely careful about what we have published.
Agreed.
Always going to the government, and the government making their case, and I think erring on the side of, okay, the government says this, let's listen, does it make sense? And so there is a lot left out. So I'm not sure, I mean, you kind of are suggesting that the reporters are a bunch of people rushing into the, and just kind of publishing willy-nilly, but that's not the way it works, right? Is that right,
I agree
Mark,
with that.
or am I?
Sure. I mean, like on any beat you cover, right, you're going to be calling for comment, you're going to be going to the agency you're writing about, and it's happening actually far more than it used to, where the government pushes back now to try to get you to not publish. Now, you know, we, I think, keep pretty high standards for what we would not publish, and there are different standards. If the government is making a case that this does specific harm to specific individuals, this story I'm talking about, that's one thing, and we listen to it really seriously. If the argument, as was the case in many of the WikiLeaks arguments, was you know, this is going to be really embarrassing for us, the government. It will hurt, you know, that is a lower standard, and usually that's not a reason not to publish. But
And when you go to the government, you learn all kinds of things. First of all, you get a second or third source if you can get them to validate what you have, which makes sleep much easier at night. And often in those conversations, it's not just a matter of calling and saying, I want your one-sentence comment. It's meeting with people, it's having serious discussions. Sometimes weeks or months go by before some of these stories are published.
I think we're finally beginning to learn what Bob Woodward does, the inside, the inside story.
Well, but it makes sense. And I've been in the Oval Office and the 7th floor of the CIA and other places where people have said, if you publish this, you know, recently somebody said, if you publish this, we could lose a war. Well, that gets your attention, and you listen very, very carefully.
No, I agree. I mean, pretty much everything that I wrote in the book, The Dark Side, I ran by the authorities at the CIA just to check it, make sure it was correct, which is incredibly important, and see basically if it was going to cause some kind of undue harm. You know, we didn't always agree on, but at least I was able to weigh their arguments and see what I, you know, whether I thought they made
Mark,
sense.
go ahead.
Just add on to that, it also goes to the point about classification. I don't think it's just a question of, you know, whether something is overclassified, because we all agree that generally things are. It's really that I don't think there's a period in the country's history where that the entire war is conducted in a classified manner, right? It is a secret war. I mean, there's been the wars Iraq and Afghanistan, but so much of it is intelligence wars and wars carried out clandestinely, and they're still secret, even when they shouldn't be, like, you know, the drone strikes. Which,
by the way, they're not secret. The drone strikes.
They're not secret, but they're technically still classified.
Yeah,
and
but the government will, you know, there are people in the government who will officially validate and discuss those.
Well, but they still won't, you know, after a strike, come up and, you know, stand up and say this is what happened. Some people really would like that, in the government would like that to happen because they think they would be able to explain it better. But and so I just think that it's therefore, it's never been more important, because this is the conduct of the war. It's all secret, that national security reporters tell people what's going on.
Peter, what do you think of that, of going to the government and saying, here's what I understand happened or is going on? What do you say?
Well, I would say that's a useful and generally necessary step. You know, we have a story out this morning that I co-authored on The Intercept, one of the first look sites, which is about some NSA documents that were leaked to us by Snowden, top secret documents.
Summarize the story.
That the NSA is hacking into the computers of system administrators who are not themselves suspected of doing anything wrong, but who control computer systems that the NSA wants to infiltrate. So these are innocent people who are targeted by the NSA because they have, as one of the documents said, the keys to the kingdom. In this case, we went to the NSA and said, look, is there any harm involved in us publishing this? And the answer was no. There was no harm involved. And so we have gone to them and asked. But I would say, however, you know, in terms of the usefulness of talking to officials, yes, of course. But actually right now, I trust documents more than I trust officials. Yeah. These documents say a lot more and tell me a lot more than most officials would. They are a potent tool when you go to the government and say, I have this document and it says the following. And so my personal feeling is I'm not using these as tools. Yeah. I'm publishing them, or we're publishing them. Yeah. The greatest tools are instruments, and I think that these documents operate best not as instruments in terms of leverage with government officials, but instruments in terms of informing the public.
I mean,
I'm not saying only as a tool, but you know, yes, publish them, but it is when you go in to see somebody in the government and say, I have this document or I have these notes of this meeting and I understand the following is occurring, that gets their attention.
It gets their attention, but it doesn't necessarily get much truth out of them.
No, sometimes it does. Sometimes don't you find that to be the case, Jane?
I think that the government, the national security part of the government anyway, has a credibility problem at this point when you look at cases like the case of Tom Drake, and who was an NSA official, former, who was prosecuted under the Espionage Act, was facing potentially 35 years in prison. He was 57 or 8 years old, whatever he was at the time, the rest of his life in prison. And the case fell apart. And the reason it was complete overkill. The judge himself eventually threw most of it out.
And even General Hayden said publicly that it was a case of prosecutorial overreach.
I mean, and as the previous panel quoted the judge saying, it was unconscionable what had happened to his life during that period. There were 5 documents he was charged with taking that were unauthorized, that were classified. 3 of them had to do with some kind of a complaint he had made to an inspector general, and he'd said he'd been told to take the documents home. The other 2, one was classified as just plain, office items, basically, and the other was declassified 3 months after he was prosecuted for having it. And eventually the case ended up with him pleading to a misdemeanor. But the idea that that could have been portrayed as a huge national security case under the Espionage Act, and that man could have faced potentially life in prison, suggests that there's a judgment issue sometimes on these calls about what national security entails.
Bob Dietz, how come that wasn't stopped earlier?
I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know the case well enough. I know Drake. I know some of the people he's dealt with, but I don't know the facts of that case. And as you know, facts matter.
Of course. Let me ask this general question, which I think is important. And the earlier panel said quite directly that the Obama administration is anti-press, and that actually, it was said earlier that the prosecution or the effort to get Jim Risen from the New York Times to testify is a persecution. Do you think the Obama administration is anti-press? Peter, start.
I wish you could have started with somebody else here.
Okay.
Anti-press is a very broad phrase, so I'd like to get away from that maybe. And just the specifics are, how many people have been prosecuted, leakers, under the Obama administration versus previous administrations. And as the previous panel, I believe, went over, and as we all know, it's more than any other previous administration by several factors. That's rather concerning to me. And when I was listening into the previous panel, one of the people said, well, but there's the Jim Risen case, but really that's kind of it in terms of actual journalists who are now facing incarceration if the Supreme Court rules against them. Yes, and you don't need more than one case to make your message. That's the point of that case. So that case is equivalent to me to hundreds of cases because the impact is the same in terms of the message it sends.
Mark, you think the Obama administration's anti-press?
Like Peter, I'm going to punt that direct term, but but no, I mean, but I'll answer your question. I mean, we've had trouble sort of digging into what are the origins of this incredibly large number of investigations, and some of it is
they're not just investigations,
and
they're
prosecutions, right? The tools available to the investigators are far better than they used to be. So prosecutors want to prosecute and they want to make cases, so they can make cases better than they used to be able to make cases. So there's part of that, but at the very least, you certainly see. Supervisors can tell investigators not to go in certain directions, and that is not happening. And so at the very least, the aggressive prosecutors trying to make their cases against leakers aren't being stopped. And yes, some of these cases are holdovers from the Bush administration, but at the very least, there are conscious decisions being made not to stop them. And that is, I think, where you see the continuity between Bush and Obama.
But just bureaucratically, being realistic about the way the Justice Department works, people at the lower level start a case and they get very aggressive, and it's just like one of your editors at the New York Times would hesitate to tell you, don't pursue that story, because it might appear as if they're stopping you from a legitimate inquiry. So I think up the chain, if you talk to some of these people, there's a lot of reluctance to stop it. The difficulty is they're not setting the policy at the very top and saying, just from my point of view, I think they are harming themselves by either declaring or appearing to declare a war on the press.
But what frustrates me a little bit about the way this discussion is categorized, by hypothesis, all these cases involved somebody who committed a felony.
Maybe.
I said by hypothesis. In other words, enough prima facie case, and just like the police investigate robberies and white-collar crime and so forth, it's very hard for me to understand the argument that says, well, this felony shouldn't be investigated. And if you are trying to put together a case, well, Archie Cox, you know, the Watergate prosecutor until he was bounced, in one of his briefs starts out saying something like, the grand jury is entitled to every man's evidence. And he's quoting some British jurist. How is it that you put a line around this felony and say, don't worry about it, but we're going to pursue other felonies? But to me, that's just crazy.
But then
Sorry.
this is good. But so then every time a White House official gives some comment about a classified drone strike, isn't that a felony too? I mean, should you go down? You could really broaden it to everyone talking about classified information.
Look, I agree with your point, and every time I've been involved in these discussions, I've pointed out how official leaks make the administration lose the high ground. For absolutely sure. I mean, it's so hard to explain rationally why a senior official can leak, and yet when it happens at the GS-15 level, then the world's about to end. I agree with you, but nonetheless,
but that's
felony
a really big problem.
It's a huge problem.
In the earlier panel, I mean, you can't talk with people about national security issues and not discuss classified information. I mean, that is just the reality.
Yeah.
You know that
I agree.
yourself.
I agree with you.
And so the idea that these few cases where they seem to have evidence and they pursue them with this zeal and these tools that they have, somebody at the top needs to, I mean, I think this is a common sense solution to kind of say, come on, let's get real.
Is this worth it in this case, you mean?
Yeah,
I agree.
I mean, is it really worth it?
I agree.
And, the idea that the Obama administration, I mean, do you think the Obama administration is anti-press?
I think every administration is anti-press. Every administration.
I've known some.
It's just
I've known some.
some more than others.
Yeah.
Some you've known more than others.
And so I think there's a continuity here rather than.
Yes, I think. I mean, it's that it's what the framers of the Constitution understood. Power has a certain tendency to make people want to hold on to power, and leaks, particularly of unflattering information, are not welcomed by people in power. So, I mean, I think the problem with the prosecutions is there's a sense that they're arbitrary because there are authorized leaks that come that are favorable and push one particular line, and then there are some that are unfavorable and they're prosecuted.
I agree.
And so, so the question is who gets to define and decide what the American public should hear about what the intelligence community is doing? Should the intelligence community get to decide only, or should the press get to decide also? And should there be, what do you do with dissidents within your ranks who are critics, who feel that maybe that what they're seeing has crossed some line and is wrong, and they want to speak out about it? It's such an American, sort of act to speak up and in dissent.
And don't you think most people, not everyone, but it's so, I mean, to use the legal term, Bob Dietz, admission against interest, that you will find people, if you can talk to them for a long time, they may say something that's against their interest that's true. And just in the last 10 or so minutes, I mean, what's the remedy for the press in terms of how we operate? Is it to go encrypted? I mean, Snowden told you, Peter, he said, it's, an amazing quote, unencrypted journalist source communication is unforgivably reckless.
When encryption is required. Not every communication that I have with a source requires encryption. Not every relationship requires it, but when it's required and you don't do it, then it is unforgivably reckless because, as Jane was saying earlier, you get your sources into a
What do you
heap of
do
trouble.
as a reporter, Mark, in this environment then? What kind of frame of mind do you go into? Are you kind of, hey, look, now I have an excuse, I can tell my editors, I talked to 6 people and they all hung up on me.
That sounds good, actually. To excuse it. you know, you have to, as I said, a lot of it is more less efficient. I think you have to be conscious of the security of your sources. I mean, you're entering into a trust, and you know, I think when you're dealing with people who have been involved in government as their sources, you're inclined to think they know how to keep themselves secure. I mean, they know better than I do the state of the surveillance, right? But I don't think that gets you off the hook, and I think it means that you have to be very careful, increasingly careful, that, you know, it's not because of something you've done you get your source in trouble.
But I think
But I would
part of-
also say,
Go ahead.
I mean, I would just also say that this isn't a big mystery to me. I mean, they're very, you know, this thing that we all carry around, well, sometimes you don't carry it around. That's an important measure of protection that actually is very easy to take, and you don't use this thing at certain times. For a very long time, reporters managed to do very well without these devices. And
I remember the first time I talked to somebody who was in a very important position in the intelligence world, and he got out his BlackBerry and took out the battery.
Sure, yeah.
And I thought, what the hell are you doing? And he said, you know, then they can't listen.
But this is something that's been going on. I remember in 1999, when I was still covering the Balkans, I was in Belgrade. This is during the Milosevic era. And cell phones had just kind of entered the society there at that time. Before you had any conversation with anybody about politics, you would not only take out the battery of your phone, but you would put it on the table, the phone and the battery. Not just so that you showed the other person that the government couldn't be listening, but that the other person knew that you weren't recording the call with their cell phone. And this was back in 1999. So, you know, the kind of tradecraft that we now have to adopt actually has been used, and I've been using in other countries for quite a while. It's not so new in some ways.
But I'd like to address
Go ahead, Bob.
the question you asked a minute or so ago about what's the solution. Well, the solution is the American people. You know, the American people, through their representatives, have decided that there are some things that are sufficiently important that they ought not to be discussed in the open press. Now, there are plenty of ways of addressing that. If you get the American people to agree to a shield law, that's not happened, and I think it will. I'd be surprised if it ever happens.
But, I mean, sometimes the representatives of the people get it wrong.
Of course they do.
And, you know, we're on the outside. Yeah, and so I don't buy that. I mean, I think the part of the remedy is to be more aggressive, frankly. And,
As a reporter?
As a reporter, and that you have to work harder. I remember working on the fourth Bush book that I did, and there was a general who would not talk. Emails, you know, phone messages, intermediaries, nothing. So I found out where he lived. It was in the Washington area. And what's the best time to visit a four-star general?
Dinner?
Without an appointment. 8:15 on a Tuesday, because they will have eaten, not gone to bed. It's not Monday, and it's not getting close to Friday, and so I knock on the door, and he opened the door, and he looked at me, and he said, "Are you still doing this shit?" And he meant it, and he looked at me, and then just got a disappointed look on his face, disappointed in himself, and he said, "Come on in," and sat for 2 hours, answered most of the questions. Why? Because I showed up. We don't show up enough. And it is incredible, the drop-in visit, if you're worried about surveillance and security and so forth. And I think if we ever get, you know, the Obama administration, I've done 2 books on them, you know, tried to understand, and I think there's a lot of ambivalence about the press, as there always is, and you can deal with them, and if you just show up and persist and say, "I've got this," we can do our job. And the tragedy of this would be if we kind of pack up and say, "Oh, you know, it's too hard." The Snowden era and the prosecution era has created a new world for us. And I think it's really kind of the old world. I started in this in the Nixon era, and it was, you know, it wasn't that you were on their Christmas card list. And it always is tough. And we should remember that. And so if you work 8 hours a day, you're maybe going to have to work 10 or 12.
I've sat on cul-de-sacs and curbs waiting for people to come home. Not so long ago, really. It wasn't really the kind of grand life I thought that the New Yorker would be. I thought it was going to be cocktails at the round table, you know.
And if you're honest with yourself, you probably don't sit on the curbs enough.
Oh, I'm sure not
Okay.
enough. But at the same time, I have to say, I'll say one thing from your standpoint, which at least what I imagine would be your standpoint, which is I think the press needs also to make sure that when we do push really hard and make our calls so that something's important enough to publish when the national security community is saying don't, it really should be something important enough to publish. And I think it needs to have some kind of, that we should try to keep thinking about something that serves public interest. Not every secret is equal. You know, and just because you find it out doesn't mean you need to put it in the newspaper or the magazine. It has to, I feel anyway, there should be an important public purpose when you take that on.
I would just say following up on your point, everybody's point here kind of about sitting on curbs. I mean, one of the things, it depends on whose curb you're sitting. Generals have told you some very useful things, and that has been helpful for everybody. I personally have found in covering Iraq, Afghanistan, being with generals, being with colonels, being with lance corporals, that actually the people whose doorsteps, quote unquote, I sit on, the better ones are the lower level. The generals I have talked to, I mean, I remember one time I had a kind of off-the-record talk with Petraeus, and I was taking notes and thinking, wow, this is great. And I look at my notes afterwards, and there's really nothing in there whatsoever. It's one of his geniuses.
Absolutely.
What?
He's very good.
Yeah, he's really good at that.
So's Mike Hayden, by the way, in the same way.
Yeah, yeah. And that happened again and again with the senior officers that I would talk with, whereas when I was talking with and hanging out with, you know, the specialists, the lance corporals, the captains, I was finding out a heck of a lot more about what was really going on. That was a lot more useful.
But then you move up the food chain. I agree with you that sometimes the best sources are names we never hear about and no one else knows. But then you have to, if you're ultimately trying to write about decision making, you need to get to the generals and the people in the White House or the Pentagon who are making some of these decisions, or the CIA.
I don't have the Bob Woodward special sauce to get that access.
But what gets people to respond is information. If you have the document or the notes or the details, if you go in and say, I understand you're launching Operation Pink Starling tomorrow, and you know, Pink Starling is a protected code word,
right.
People will say, okay, we better deal with this.
But actually, the higher level people probably don't know what Pink Starling is. I mean, there are the programs if we're just talking about the NSA, there are so many of them, and they are so technical that I would be really surprised if the high level people know the details of more than a small number of the most major programs.
I think you'd be wrong about that.
Yeah?
I think so. I mean, many could not perhaps describe the engineering details, but I would be surprised if there are more than a handful of programs that are not understood.
Well, okay, I
by
take back the
leadership.
handful, you're right. But there are, I mean, impossible to count how many programs there are in the NSA.
There are.
That we're talking, well, we can talk thousands and probably more than thousands.
Certainly hundreds,
And I just
yeah.
imagine it's beyond the capacity of any individual to have significant knowledge about more than a handful of these thousands of programs. That's what I was trying to say.
But I agree with Bob Dietz. I mean, and I agree with you. But the answer is work the low level, the mid level, and the top if you can. Right. And you're going to get a total universe portrait. Anybody else? We have a couple of minutes here before there's a coffee and martini break. Maybe not martinis, but to summarize I mean, Dietz, you're the historian of this. What's going on here? When the historians look back at this era, what are they going to say? The Snowden era, the prosecution era, the persecution of Jim Risen era, or?
I don't have an apocalyptic vision. I don't think, unlike some members of the first panel, I don't think the West is about to end. The civilization as we know it is disappearing. I think there are new challenges. The tension that Jane was describing between administrations and the press. I worked in the Carter administration, and my God, the wailing that went on there about stuff in the newspapers. I don't think that's ever going to end. I would like to mention one more thing, if I may, Bob. In these discussions, there's often a lot of talk about, as Peter did, a reference to the Fourth Amendment. The Supreme Court has, in the two cases that really address Fourth Amendment issues in the criminal context that may touch on national security, they've always drawn a line between, on the one hand, domestic security, criminal stuff that involves criminality in this country. On the other hand, dividing that from national security involving threats abroad. And in the two major cases on this, the Supreme Court went out of its way to say, all right, we're not talking about foreign intelligence here, we're talking about domestic intelligence. My experience at NSA is that line was rigorously drawn and rigorously observed. That is, I think most reporters should rest easy about whether there's going to be a tap. And I don't believe there is necessarily a Fourth Amendment right when you're talking about conducting foreign intelligence.
But most reporters who cover issues like terrorism, for instance, have many overseas phone calls.
From terrorists?
Certainly from as close as you can get to them if you want to do the reporting. Sure,
might,
you're going to try to
to
get in there and understand what's going on. Many reporters, John Miller, who worked in and out of the government, was famous for going to interview bin Laden. Is that a crime? Should it have been eavesdropped on?
Forgetting whether it's a crime, if somebody is speaking with bin Laden on the phone and we're not picking it up, the head of NSA ought to be tossed.
But yeah, right. But Bob, under NSA rules, if that were the case, it was Jane Mayer, an American citizen, her name would have to
It
minimized.
would be minimized.
Would not be
well, maybe not in Jane's
circulated.
case. But yes.
Maximized.
Yes, exactly. All headlines. No, you're dead right. It would have to be minimized, and the minimization rules are religiously followed.
Okay. I think we're done. Thank you very much, and now we're
That's great.